Hi everyone, so this is our fourth tutorial, but we're still using lesson 2 of my GitHub. In this tutorial, we're going to delve a bit deeper into entities. And in particular, we're going to have a look at the player controller entity. So you'll note that currently we have a red box that's able to move around our world. That itself is actually, well, some of the code has been taken from the first-person shooter sample in Ursina, but I'm going to show you how we actually create that player controller. You'll note that inside my start game function, I create a variable called player, and it is of type player object. Now, at the top of my page, you'll see that I am importing a piece of code called player.py. And inside player.py is my player object. Just to note, because I don't think I've mentioned it previously, you'll notice I've called it globals.player. And you'll also note I use the word globals down here when I actually create my game. The reason for that is that when you do game development, sometimes you want to make it so that a different file, a different Python file, can access variables that were defined in another file. So to do that, what we actually do is we create ourselves a global vars py file. In fact, you could call it something else if you wanted to, but I like to call it global vars for global variables. You can see inside the file, I've got a game, I've got a player, and I'm actually going to have an enemy list. And when I create my game, so after I exit my game class, you'll notice that I create my Ursina application. I actually create the game, and I actually store that inside my globals variables. So I've actually imported in that file. I've said import global vars as globals. So it imports that file there, brings it into my code, and I've called it globals. I store my game inside that. So this game object, when I create it, is stored inside global vars. And anytime I import that file, I'll have access to those global variables. Now, one of the important variables is the use of the player. So with the player, I've stored that inside my global variables. Now, you might think, well, I could always have stored that inside the game itself, simply by using self. And you're right, I could have. But I like to have it a bit different. So I'm actually going to create, in the start of my game, I'm going to create this player object. And the player object actually inherits code from first-person controller. Now, if you've used the Ursina first-person controller sample code, I think they just create the object using like one line of code. But I want to make it so that I can extend the code that is inside the first-person controller. First-person controller is actually under the Ursina prefabs library. So it's basically prefabricated code that you can use. I don't know all the code that's inside it. What I do know is that it allows you to create an object that can move around the world. It has a camera. You can add a model to it. It can jump. It's got collisions. So it actually is very, very useful in terms of creating a first-person shooter. And it saves me a lot of code. But what I do want to do is I want to make it so that my player object takes all that first-person controller code and then extends upon it and builds upon it. So when I inherit code, and again, I'd recommend you do look up object inheritance. I'm taking all that code and basically extending it. The important thing is that when you do inherit from another object, you need to call that object's functions. One of them being super. Whenever you want to call that object's functions, you go super, and then I can call its init function. You'll notice that when I do update, I call super, and I call its update function. When I do input, I call super, and I call its input function. If I didn't do that, I would actually replace entirely the code that was inside the first person shooter object. So I don't want to replace its code, I want to build upon it. So by using the super keyword, I can actually replace, I can just extend the parts that I want. Now, what you can do is if you want to change some of the values here, you can. You'll notice that I pass a position. I've also used the word vec3. You don't actually have to, but if you put vec3 in front of your coordinates, x, y, and z, it means you're able to add things to it later on. So it's actually a simple way of adding vectors together. But you get the general idea here. So you can edit these values if you want. But it will essentially, when I press play, it creates my player object. And then at the end of my game, I destroy my player object. And the player object itself, I should mention, is also a form of entity. So we're talking about inheritance. The first person controller also inherits from the entity object. Right, so let's have a look as it currently stands. I turned off the music because it was starting to annoy me and I realized it was drowning out my voice. So I'm just going to press play here. And you can see that I've got a red box that I'm just moving around the screen. That is my first person controller. Using my mouse, I'm actually just controlling the camera that is inside the first person controller object. And one of the things about the first person controller object is that WASD moves it around, space allows it to jump, and it can't go through anything that has a collision box. So I can't go through the wall at the moment. Right, let's build upon that because I want to look at how we can add to our entities and actually put in more, well, models essentially. So I'm going to look at the player object here, and I wanted to make it so that I could actually give it a 3D character. So what I'm going to do is to create a 3D character. Well, there's a number of ways to do it. The way I'm going to do it is I wanted to have some animation. So I'm actually going to chuck in some Panda 3D code, which I know is kind of confusing, but Ursina is based on Panda 3D. So to actually give it a model, I can actually create an actor object and I can feed it the models that are currently inside Ralph. So Ralph has got a number of models. It's actually, the Ralph object is actually using an Ursina 3D model format, which I haven't found for the rest of my game, but I've done it here. So I'm going to put it in, and if you just put it in and don't set a scale, it actually comes in quite large. What you do, however, need to do is you need to attach it to your actual entity. So when you actually bring in an actor, which is like a 3D model that is animated, I'm actually going to have to reparent that to my player object. Now, if I run that as so, it is actually going to come in quite large. So I'm just going to press play here to show you. This is the thing, when you do bring in 3D models, sometimes you just have no idea about the size of the model. You can adjust the size of the model in Blender if you want, but it's sometimes a bit of a hassle. Sometimes the easiest way to actually adjust your model is to simply play around with the scale coordinates, because the scale will control its X, Y, and Z coordinates, or its scale in terms of those units. So you can see at the moment I've brought in my Ralph object, and Ralph's quite large and he's facing the wrong direction, which I knew would happen. Now I've just gone into editor mode by pressing tab, and my task is to somehow get it so that he is actually going to be running around my map. So I'm just going to press escape to quit. Now I'm going to go back to my player. First thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change his scale. Now I'm going to basically downsize him by 0.5 in all directions. So his width is going to be 0.5, his height is going to be 0.5, and his backwards, going back in depth, is going to be 0.5. If you put a negative value into set scale or into the scale value, it'll actually flip your model around, which is a really useful trick. So just know that sometimes when you bring in a 3D model, it will come in the completely wrong way. It might be facing the wrong direction, it might be too large, etc. What you need to do is you'll need to change the scale of it, and you'll also need to flip sometimes the direction it's going. So I'm actually going to flip it on its Z axis. The Ralph model itself has an animation called run. So I'm going to start that animation. And then finally, I'm going to actually get rid of the cube because I don't need the cube. So I'm just going to get rid of the cube, and I'm going to get rid of the color red. And I'm actually just going to get rid of the collider being box because I don't need those things. Instead, I'm going to create my own collision box because I've got to create a collision box that fits my model. So to create my own collision box, and I did mention that all entities can be given a collision box. If an entity doesn't have a collision box, it basically can be ran through. You can run through it like a ghost. If you want something to collide with something else, you need to give it a collision box. And you can either do that inside the object itself, like so, and that's a default collision box. So it'll try to create a box that is the correct size for your model, but sometimes it doesn't work. There's other types of collision boxes. So there's actually mesh, which is where it tries to fit the collision box to the mesh itself, or you might have sphere. But if you want a custom collision box, which I did in this case, you have to create one. So I'm actually creating a custom collision box called a box collider, and I'm actually going to set the values of that box to fit my model. And this is where you kind of have to play around a bit to get it so that it fits your model perfectly. One of the things I have done before is actually created an entity that is actually exactly the same size as this box collider, rendered it on the screen, and just seen that it fits my model. But it does take a lot of playing around. For the moment, I've done this before, so I'm going to put that in, and I'm going to press play on my game. You always have to execute your game file. I'm going to press play, and it should have brought in my model, and it should have animated it, and hopefully it's also got rid of the red box that I had initially in the first person controller. It does. There you go. So now I'm running around as Ralph. If I press tab, you can see that I can actually zoom around him. And yes, it is possible to change his animation, but it does require a bit of tricky code, so I'm not going to do it in these set of tutorials. So I'm just going to skip that. I'm going to exit out. And that gives you an idea about how the player object works. Now, if you want to change the camera, you can see that my camera pivot is currently negative 3.5 units behind him. Now, let's just say I wanted to go a bit further up and above. I could do that just by changing the pivot. So for some people's games, they might like to have it so you can see the character a bit higher up, a bit more of a helicopter type view. Certainly you can do that simply by changing the camera pivot. And there you go. So now you can see where Rolf is, and I'm a bit higher up. And it's using the camera to determine my viewpoint in the 3D world. So if you want to change your camera pivot, certainly you can do so. Some people might like to hide the model completely. You can always do that as well. So there you go. There's an overview of my player controller object. But it is the hardest thing, I think, is definitely bringing the 3D model, scaling it, and also creating a box collider. And I'll do it again for the snowman entity at a later tutorial. So you'll see how you can go about doing that. But without the collider or a collision, you won't be able to properly detect collisions in your game. Right, and I'm going to finish the tutorial there. Thank you for listening.